5 million people woke up this morning believing in a version of prehistory that one researcher says was built, brick by brick, inside the very universities we trust to get things right. Not on the fringes of the internet, inside Harvard, Barnard, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Smith, Wellesley and Vassar. Today we're pulling apart the case against Gaia Theory, what it actually claims, why the science may not hold up, and what a researcher who calls himself an unknown soldier says he found hidden inside some of the most famous artifacts in human history. By the end of this episode, you'll understand the two competing versions of Gaia Theory, the empirical argument against its central promise, and a genuinely wild counterclaim about what those ancient female figurines actually are. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this material, so let's get into it. Walk me through what Gaia Theory even is, because I think most people have a vague sense of it.
Right, so the first thing to understand is that Gaia Theory isn't one thing. The source material actually identifies two distinct strains of thought operating under that same umbrella. The first strain, which the author calls the derivatist position, holds that life on a planet evolves over millions of years into communities of organisms that eventually combine, almost spiritually, to bootstrap Gaia into existence. So, in this view, Gaia is a kind of meta-being, a distributed consciousness that emerges from all living things, almost like a planetary neural network.
So Gaia is the output, not the input.
Exactly. And that's actually a complete inversion of how every major world religion frames creation, where a creator exists first and then makes everything else. The derivatist position flips that entirely. Now, the second strain, which the author calls the originalist position, actually agrees with major religions in one key way. It says Gaia is larger than any single planet, that she encompasses the universe to its full extent, and therefore must have existed before all her children. So these two camps disagree on the origin question pretty fundamentally.
But they agree on something.
They agree on the big one, which is homeostasis. Both strains hold that Gaia has the ability to assert and maintain environmental homeostasis on life-bearing planets. And that's where the environmental dogma comes from. The idea that if humanity aligns its behavior with natural processes, Gaia will heal, and a temperate epoch of growth and prosperity will persist for billions of years. That's the promise. That's the promised land being offered.
And the neo-pagan religious framework wraps around all of this, the matriarchal prehistory, the goddess worship, all of that. How does that connect?
So the neo-pagan narrative of prehistory, as the author describes it, holds that human beings were originally led by matriarchs and worshipped a feminine deity, not always called Gaia by every group, but acknowledged in retrospect as Gaia in form and function. And the evidence offered for this is primarily the Paleolithic art portfolio, all those images of ample-breasted women found throughout prehistoric sites. In the Neopagan reading, these figurines are the foundations of a matriarchal deity once worshipped universally.
And the author has a pretty sharp response to that.
He does, and he doesn't pull punches. He asks, and I'm paraphrasing here, couldn't all of these images just be Paleolithic art depicting the human form? He frames it as a fair question given what we know about human nature. But then he pivots immediately and says, no, actually, his research into thousands of artifacts reveals something far more specific. Nearly all of the female figurines on which Gaia theology rests are compositions in an archaic writing system based in part on cartography.
Okay, we are going to come back to that because that is a massive claim. But first, why does any of this matter beyond being a religious disagreement? What are the actual stakes academically?
That's the right question to ask, and the author is very direct about it. He names specific institutions, Harvard, Barnard, Bryn Mawr, Mount Holyoke, Smith, Wellesley, Vassar, as having fully accredited faculty and curricula that establish, reinforce, and promote what he calls presumptive histories of pagan culture in Europe and Arabia. And then those pseudo-histories, as he calls them, get applied as a template to indigenous cultures across the globe. So this isn't a fringe internet debate. He's arguing the error is load-bearing inside mainstream academia.
And he connects it to a failure of peer review specifically.
Consistently. His argument is that the protocols of empirical method require you to prove your hypotheses and subject your findings to peer review. And his charge is that none of the academic faculty complicit in what he calls an intellectual farce adhered to empirical method, and their peers were, in his words, all too happy to co-sign checks being written in the name of neo-pagan goddesses and gods. That's a pretty damning indictment.
It really is. And he uses this analogy early in the piece that I found genuinely disarming. the Pokemon comparison.
Right, and it's effective precisely because it's absurd. He asks you to imagine that universities across the world had all taught their students that Pokemon was based on an ancient belief system and that Pikachu was the supreme deity in that system. We'd all laugh, he says, because we all agree Pokemon is fiction. But then he says, stay with me. What if it turned out that Pokemon was not fiction, but was actually a composition in an archaic writing system that encrypted the geographical boundaries of a real realm? Suddenly, accredited academia begins to unravel. And that, he argues, is the actual situation with Gaia.
The analogy works because it isolates the ethics of the situation from the content. Like, the problem isn't what you believe, it's whether the institution teaching it has done the empirical work.
Exactly, and that's where he lands. He's not saying neo-pagans are bad people, he's actually quite sympathetic. He mentions his own sister is a Wiccan priestess and says he knows of which he speaks when it comes to the cognitive shock this discovery would cause to over 5 million neo-pagans who don't deserve to wake up and discover they were misled. The target of his critique is the academic infrastructure, not the believers.
Let's get into the scientific critique now, because this is where it gets really interesting. The homeostasis claim, what's the actual empirical problem with it?
So the author's core scientific argument is this. There has never been a period in the history of our planet when the Earth's environment achieved climatic homeostasis, and there never will be. He's saying that entropy, thermal death, is such a universal feature of the material world that it might have been considered a law of the universe. And if that's true, then Gaia Theory's central promise that humanity can restore paradise by harmonizing with natural processes is not just optimistic, it's empirically impossible.
And he contrasts that with how the world's major religions handle the same problem.
Right. He argues that all the major religious traditions, and he's careful to include traditions beyond just Judaism and Christianity, address in terms fit for each tradition the struggle humanity faces in coping with life on a planet that requires work to survive. And not one of them promises what Gaia Theory claims, that paradise can be evoked in the temporal world by human beings. All of them propose personal spiritual discipline to cope with hardship. Gaia Theory alone promises earthly restoration.
Which sets up this really pointed internal contradiction he identifies. If Gaia is capable of achieving planetary homeostasis, if that's her power, then why isn't the current trend toward global warming just Gaia healing herself?
That's the contradiction, he says, no one in the neo-pagan movement has ever resolved. He frames it almost like a courtroom challenge, anyone? And the silence is the answer. Because if you believe Gaia can self-regulate to a stable temperature across all latitudes, you have to explain why the current warming trend isn't just that process in action. You can't simultaneously hold that Gaia heals herself and that the current climate trajectory is a crisis caused by human failure. Those two positions are in direct tension.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of question that sounds almost too simple, but it's actually devastating if you sit with it.
It is. And he extends the physical critique further by walking through what the planet actually is. Not a loving, nurturing, self-healing goddess, but in his words, a nuclear reactor experiencing a meltdown as it hurtles through space. He goes through the numbers. The planet's surface at the equator is moving at just over 1,000 miles per hour due to axial rotation. The planet orbits the sun at roughly 67,000 miles per hour, and the entire solar system is orbiting the black hole at the center of our galaxy at approximately 449,000 miles per hour.
Wait, 449,000 miles per hour?
That's what he states. He calls it just over Mach 561. And his point is that at those velocities, the slightest perturbation would be catastrophic. The planet is not a stable, nurturing environment gently tending to its children. It's a molten ball of metals and minerals spinning at fantastic speeds. The crust we live on is an extraordinarily thin layer of solid matter on top of all of that. The image of a loving planetary mother is, in his framing, a profound misreading of physical reality.
He also makes this point about entropy being the thing that will ultimately end everything, and he ties that back to Genesis in a way I didn't expect.
Yeah, and this is where the piece gets philosophically interesting. He argues that Genesis is empirically correct on the question of entropy, that death will overcome all systems within creation, but that a literal reading of Genesis doesn't lead to that conclusion because most rabbis and priests don't actually know what a day is in the archaic sense. He spent time as a young man trying to disprove Genesis empirically and ended up concluding that a day in the ancient Arabian scholarly tradition is not a unit of time, but a phenomenon in physics, an oscillation between higher and lower ambient energy states.
That's a genuinely surprising turn in the argument.
It is. And he extends it, Tidal days within axial days within annual days within orbital days, solar days, galactic days, and ultimately a universal day. He identifies 7 distinct oscillations of energy in the universe and says ancient Arabian scholars were arriving at conclusions that were not just scientific in appearance, they were actually science. He uses that distinction throughout. Something can appear scientific without being science, and something can be science without appearing scientific to modern eyes.
Which is actually a really useful epistemological distinction. The aesthetic of science versus the substance of it.
Exactly. And he applies that same lens to Hindu cosmogony. He points out that Hindu scholars believed the universe was egg-shaped, which was dismissed for centuries, and then the cosmic microwave background radiation was measured and documented, and it turns out the universe is in fact oblong and elliptical in 3 dimensions. He says nobody can laugh at Hindu models of creation anymore. And he uses that to argue that archaic scholars were practicing verifiable science, just in terminology and aesthetics that modern academia no longer accepts.
Okay, so now let's get to the iconographic claim, because this is the part that I think is either the most important thing in the piece or the most extraordinary claim, and those aren't mutually exclusive. He says he deciphered an archaic writing system in 2011. What did he actually find?
So he describes discovering this in Cardiff, Wales, when he accidentally deciphered something called the Bryn Celli Thi pattern stone in the National Museum of Wales, a megalith discovered in 1929 and radiocarbon dated to around 3,500 BC. What he says he found was that the composition was not art but language, specifically a writing system based in part on cartography. The rule he identifies is that every composition had to look like the realm it documented. The borders and general details were based on actual geography.
And then he found the same thing in Spain.
The Dama de Elche, which is one of the most famous artifacts from ancient Iberia, dated to around 400 BC. It was previously thought to be a funerary urn or an imported fetish. He says that when you place the Dama de Elche in profile next to a satellite image of Spain and Portugal in isolation, the correspondence is, in his words, nearly irrefutable. The composition is a map of the Iberian Peninsula. He calls her the Mother of the West, the motherland of a realm whose visage is literally based on the contours of Iberian topography.
And the same logic applies to the Venus of Willendorf, which is basically the most famous prehistoric female figurine in existence and a cornerstone of neo-pagan goddess theology.
That's his most radical single claim. He says the Venus of Willendorf is a map, specifically a cartographic representation of a region he calls Greater Macedonia. And if that's true, it doesn't just challenge neo-pagan theology, it dismantles the entire evidentiary foundation of the Gaia goddess narrative, because the figurines that are supposed to prove a universal prehistoric matriarchal religion are actually geographic documents.
He lays out 3 compositional rules for this writing system, right? Walk me through those.
3 rules. Rule 1, the Constitution, that's what he calls these compositions, had to look just like the realm it documented. Borders and general details based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom. This is why archaic rulers wore those elaborate headdresses. The headdress was a representation of the realm's geography. Rule 3, every station of the nobility and many domains of the learned had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other. So these aren't just maps, they're representative censuses of the principal leadership nodes and institutions of archaic societies.
That's actually a stunning reframe. These things we've been calling idols or goddess figurines are essentially constitutional documents.
That's precisely how he frames it. And he extends this to Egyptian hieroglyphics. He argues that each Egyptian god was a bust depicting regional geology of Africa in anamorphic similes. If your kingdom looked like a pin-tailed duck, the head of your king was depicted as a man with a pin-tailed duck's head. He says the Egyptian pantheon fell rapidly into place once he applied this framework. And he traces the writing system back to 77,000 BC following the Toba eruption in Indonesia, which would make it the oldest known information technology in human history.
And the mechanism for creating these maps, the cartographic technique, is something he calls soloromancy.
Right. And the technique itself is actually elegant in its simplicity. You place a staff upright in the ground, mark the tip of its shadow, wait for the shadow to move, mark the new position, and draw a line between the 2 stones that gives you a perfect east-to-west line every time. He says this technique remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites. From that baseline, you can measure azimuths to distant landmarks and build up an accurate cartographic record of your region. He uses Moses on Mount Sinai as his primary worked example.
And the burning bush becomes something very different in that reading.
He argues that the burning bush that was not consumed is a phonetic description of an iconographic composition, a cartographic map of the kingdom of Midian that Moses produced through 40 years of soloromantic surveying. The image of fire that doesn't consume is, in his reading, the visual appearance of intersecting survey lines on a robe or cloth, lines that form a contour resembling a burning bush. He's not saying the religious experience didn't happen, he's saying the record of it is also a geographic document.
Okay, I want to come back to the identity theft argument because I think it's the most provocative political claim in the whole piece. He's essentially saying neo-pagans accuse major world religions of cultural appropriation, and then he flips it.
He flips it completely. His argument is that neopagan narratives are themselves the greatest case of identity theft in human history. The iconography that the neopagan community claims as sacred to an earlier paganism doesn't prove what any neopagan proposes it to be. According to his maps, all of the iconography he has deciphered documents real realms, peoples along the Danube, the Balkans, the entire Hellenic world, the Italian peninsula. These are real historical peoples whose documented heritage has been claimed by a movement that, in his framing, cannot authoritatively interpret the material it's claiming.
And he makes a linguistic argument about the word pagan itself that I found really clarifying.
Yeah, this is sharp. He argues that pagan is a construct of the Christian vernacular, an adjective used to describe anyone who was not of the Christian faith. There never was a religion called paganism. There was, until the 20th century, nobody in the world who self-identified as a pagan. Pagans are, in his words, paper dolls, demographic constructs belonging to the Christian community. The same logic applies to Gentile in the Hebrew vernacular. Neither term describes a self-identified group with its own authentic tradition.
Which means the entire category of pagan religion that universities are now legally protecting in some Western nations is built on a label that was never self-applied.
That's his argument. And he notes that Western legislatures have enacted laws protecting the pagan religions of pre-Roman Europe and extended similar legal protections to syncretic belief systems elsewhere, which he says means believers of established religious traditions who question neo-pagan narratives of prehistory are now being prosecuted under civil rights statutes protecting those beliefs. He finds that inversion of justice deeply troubling.
Let's talk about the witch trial reframe, because the Nine Herbs charm section is one of the most unexpected parts of the whole piece.
So the Nine Herbs charm comes from a medieval English text called the Lacnunga. It's a recipe and an incantation that Wiccans today advocate and practice. Most of the ingredients are completely innocuous: chamomile, fennel, nettle, plantain, crab apples, mugwort, genuinely beneficial herbs. But one ingredient, which the text calls venom loather, yields lethal concentrations of cyanide when processed in concentration. And the author argues this was known in medieval England.
So the Wiccans weren't just making herbal tea.
He frames it as an early form of chemotherapy, genuinely dangerous, but in severe cases with no other resort, perhaps the only option available. And here's the twist that really reframes the witch trial narrative. The Lacnunga, which Wiccans today cite as evidence of pre-Christian healing traditions being persecuted, actually attributes the efficacy of its herbal concoctions to the Lord and to Christ specifically. Wiccans argue those references were forced by persecution. But the author says courts of law are required to base decisions on evidence, not assumptions, and the text doesn't support the persecution narrative.
And his conclusion about the witch trials themselves is actually more sympathetic than you'd expect.
He says the women persecuted were ignorant and therefore innocent, but that we must judge others according to the light they received. In medieval England, neither the accused nor the accusers understood how pathogens caused disease. The Wiccans were in fact making their patients sick, not through malice, but through a combination of genuinely beneficial herbs and one toxic ingredient. The paranoid reaction of the witch hunters was no less ignorant or superstitious than the incantations being recited. He's not defending the trials. He's saying both sides were operating in the dark.
And the grand irony he lands on is that the only genuinely efficacious contribution medicine in England had to offer until the mid-19th century was soap.
Herb soap, specifically. He says the Wiccans were essentially making soap, and that it would take nuns and monks a couple of centuries to confirm that soap, without the adulterating ingredients, was next to godliness. The tragedy is that they were so close to an efficacious theory of medicinal hygiene, and the spells got in the way. He summarizes it with characteristic bluntness. Soap, good. Vitamins and minerals, good. Casting spells, extremely bad.
I want to make sure we give fair space to the counter-argument here, because the author is making some very large claims. What would a skeptic say?
A skeptic would say several things. First, that the iconographic interpretations, the Dama de Elche as a map of Iberia, the Venus of Willendorf as a map of Greater Macedonia, haven't passed peer review. The author himself acknowledges this, saying his maps need to pass peer review before the claims are established. Second, a skeptic would note that pattern recognition is a notoriously unreliable tool, humans are extraordinarily good at seeing meaningful shapes in random data, and the history of archaeology is full of overconfident interpretations of ambiguous artifacts.
And on the Gaia Theory side?
A defender of Gaia Theory would argue that the homeostasis claim is more nuanced than the author allows, that it's not about achieving perfect climatic stability, but about the tendency of living systems to self-regulate within ranges. They'd also push back on the framing of neopaganism as pseudoscience by pointing out that the study of matriarchal prehistory draws on legitimate archaeological evidence beyond just figurines, burial practices, settlement patterns, artifact distributions. The author's critique is pointed, but the field he's critiquing is more complex than a single line of evidence.
That's fair, and I think the author would probably say, prove it, submit it to peer review. That's his consistent standard.
That is his consistent standard. And interestingly, he applies it to himself too. He's explicit that his own maps need to pass peer review. He's not claiming exemption from the process he's demanding of others. He says he has a 12-year head start on the research and invites people to try to find Gaia in the geology of Central Europe before he publishes. There's a confidence there, but also an acknowledgement that the work isn't done.
He also makes this broader historical argument that every time academia crosses an epiphanic threshold, the resulting cognitive dissonance leads to social upheaval. And he traces a line from the invention of the optical lens all the way to the Holocaust.
Right, and this is the macro-historical frame he's building toward. His argument is that failures in peer review don't just produce bad science, they produce catastrophic social consequences. He identifies what he calls 13 epiphanic thresholds in human history, from Ibn Sal's lens through Galileo's telescope, Van Leeuwenhoek's microscope, Malthus, Darwin, Pasteur, and eventually to a group of intellectuals meeting at Café Central in Vienna in 1910. Alfred Adler, Leon Trotsky, Joseph Stalin, and others, planning what he describes as a global war of extinction against the world's royalty, nobility, and bourgeoisie. All of it, he argues, traceable back to a single failure, hypothesis presented as science instead of hypothesis.
And he sees Gaia theory and biofeminism as the next iteration of that same pattern.
Explicitly. He argues that biofeminists took over where the National Socialist Workers' Party left off, that Darwin's concept of sexual selection was reiterated as biofeminism, and that by the late 1980s, biofeminist curricula was being trialed in advanced placement programs in American high schools. Gaia theory went from being treated as a syncretic collage of indigenous mythology to a seriously considered theory of science. And he says within the biofeminist movement, Gaia theory and its goddess matriarch served the same function that Atlantis and the Aryan race served for the National Socialists, as the foundational mythology justifying the pseudoscience.
That's a very serious charge. And I think it's worth noting that he's not saying neopagans are Nazis. He's saying the structural pattern of pseudoscience capturing academic institutions follows the same logic, regardless of the ideology.
That's the distinction he draws carefully. He says the only difference between the National Socialists and the neopagan movement lies in their intent. And he's clear that neopagan adherents are not the authors of this travesty, they were misled. His critique is directed at the academic infrastructure that allowed unsubstantiated claims to achieve institutional legitimacy without peer review. The believers are victims of the failure, not its architects.
And he ends with this diagnosis, idolatry, which I think is the most philosophically interesting part of the whole piece.
It's the diagnosis he applies universally. When theologians are more devoted to their interpretations of Scripture than to manifest truth, that's a form of idolatry. When scientists are more devoted to their hypothesis than to manifest truth, that's also a form of idolatry. And since everyone is, in some measure, both theologian and scientist, we're all susceptible. We believe what we believe for reasons we're convinced are justifiable, and when those justifications are exposed as fallacies, we're hard-pressed to abandon our beliefs because we define ourselves too much by what we believe. What every major religion instructs, and what peer review enforces, is that we are our own worst counsel.
So when you step back from everything we've covered today, the two strains of Gaia theory, the homeostasis contradiction, the iconographic counterclaim, the witch trial reframe, the identity theft reversal, what's the through line? What does this case study actually teach us?
I think the through line is epistemic humility and the cost of losing it. The author's argument isn't ultimately about Gaia, it's about what happens when the institutions we trust to distinguish science from pseudoscience stop doing that work rigorously. He's saying peer review isn't a bureaucratic formality, it's the mechanism that prevents hypothesis from becoming dogma. And when that mechanism fails, the consequences aren't just academic. They're social, legal, and in the most extreme historical cases, catastrophic.
And the real-world stakes are already visible. He mentions that in the United Kingdom, he could be prosecuted for suggesting Gaia is not the celestial mother as claimed by neopagans. That's not a hypothetical.
It's not. And that's where the piece becomes genuinely urgent. Western legislatures have enacted legal protections for neopagan and indigenous claims to iconography that, according to his research, none of those groups could authoritatively interpret. So you now have a situation where the legal system is enforcing a version of prehistory that the empirical record, if his iconographic work holds up, directly contradicts. The question of who gets to adjudicate that is not a small one.
And his answer is words. Let words decide. Let etymology, let cartography, let the iconographic record speak, and subject all of it to peer review.
That's his position. He's a linguist, and he says he'll limit his contribution to documented linguistic foundations. He's not asking anyone to believe what his Bible tells them, he's asking them to believe what every thermometer tells them. That's the standard he holds himself to, and it's the standard he's demanding of the institutions he's critiquing.
Here's what this really comes down to, I think. This isn't a story about Gaia. It's a story about what we owe each other when we make claims about the past, especially claims that get institutionalized, legally protected, and taught to students who have no way to evaluate the underlying evidence themselves.
And the people most harmed by getting it wrong aren't the academics. They're the 5 million neo-pagans who were told a story about their own origins and built their identities around it. And the Central Europeans, the Balkan peoples, the Hellenic world, whose actual documented heritage has been claimed by a movement that, according to this research, cannot read the documents it's claiming. Everyone in that equation deserves better than what the current institutional framework has provided.
We started this episode with the image of 5 million people who woke up this morning believing in a version of prehistory built inside the universities we trust. And the Pokemon analogy, absurd as it sounds, is actually doing real work. Because the moment you accept that the absurdity of the analogy is the point, you have to ask, who's watching the Watchmen? Who's peer-reviewing the peer reviewers? That's the question this case study leaves hanging in the air, and it's not a comfortable one. Thanks for being here for this one. If this episode made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it.